And because we didn't do our due diligence well enough, or the client didn't hire that out, essentially, that they skipped that cost, we ran into issues later in that process that then caused us to have to redesign and spend more money to get the design true to these things that we didn't consider.
If you're new to ground up construction, then today's video is for you. I'm talking to Alex Vincent, head of design at Artistry Home. They are behind some of the most innovative tree house designs out there. He's going to talk about the steps that are involved in new construction, the timeline, and how much it costs. Before we play the interview, you might be wondering if ground up construction of a glamp site, cabins, or even a single family home is hard. And the answer is yes and no. If you work with the right people and you follow the process that Alex lays out, then the process is pretty simple. And it can be a disaster if you don't have the right team in place or you don't follow the right steps. That's why it's so important that you take his advice. So let's get into it. Hello, Alex. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about yourself as well as Artistry?
My name is Alex Vincent. I am the head of design for Artistry Home. We are a unique, nature-focused design and build firm. We specialize in tree houses, but branch out into all sorts of tiny house and glamping endeavors that help bring people into connection with nature. My role is to help run our design team and help make sure that our projects are successful from conception all the way through to the last nail being driven, and making sure people have really successful, whether it's a rental property or their own home, that they love it and that their guests love it.
Let's kind of start from the beginning. What do you have to do to prepare the land in order to be able to do that, and like what types of land work best? So like, for someone who's completely new to this kind of project, what do they need to do? What are those sort of like first steps in order to prepare to build something like this?
I think from our perspective, we always look at ways that we can treat the land well. And so when we start a project, a lot of our work starts in the site planning stage, where we're looking at things like a topography map. We're looking at things like geotechnical reports. We're looking at things like even potentially bringing an arborist out onto site to identify where sensitive areas of the land are, what are key areas that we want to protect and highlight, what are areas that we can bring roads and infrastructure through without creating damage to the ecosystem. Part of our goal at Artistry is bringing people into nature. So you don't want to destroy the thing that is the asset of the project, right? So getting the surveys and the engineers together for that initial site planning effort is really important to make sure that we're protecting our most valuable assets. And then once that's completed, it's really about looking at any of your earthwork. So grading, things like roads, excavating your foundations, any of that requires large equipment wants to be done initially to make way for then the lighter and lighter things to follow, so that our touch on the land slowly lightens over time until the point where it's finished, and then it's just our normal guest access and use of the property at that point. Things that we want to look for in that initial phase are access to drinking water, septic systems to help process waste, and bringing electricity onto the site. And of course, there's always creative off-grid options for all of those things, but generally projects are looking at establishing some form of base infrastructure for power, water, and waste at that initial phase.
So given that a lot of work has to go into preparing the land before you can even think about building your structure, are there do's and don'ts or other pieces of advice you would recommend? For example, are there types of land that just don't work for this kind of project, or characteristics of land that make it a lot easier or work really well? Like, what do people need to be looking out for when even looking for land, given how much work has to be done to prepare it?
Well, I mean, I know we're going to go into cost in a little bit here, but that's definitely a big factor in selecting land. We have worked on some really challenging sites, and I wouldn't say any land is impossible. It's just the more challenging that it is, the more expensive it's going to be. Things that people want to look out for are flood zones or high water tables. So when you have a lot of saturated soil, that can become quite a challenge. You also want to look out for soil types. So really, really heavy clay or really, really rocky soil can also pose a challenge. You also want to be sensitive to the ecosystem. So if you're in an area with endangered species or endangered plant species or animals, you really want to treat those lightly and find ways to be as minimally invasive as possible. I would also consider neighbors being a big factor. If you're trying to bring people out to this peaceful, bucolic, natural experience, you want to make sure you're not building next to commercial big development. You want to make sure that you're, surrounding yourself by like-minded people or people who won't be adversely affected by your project. Otherwise, they can be a real thorn in your side throughout both the development and operation of the project.
How much time does it take to go through this process? And then we can talk about how much it costs.
I'd say for a site that's closer in and smaller to a locally developed area, whether that's existing camp infrastructure or a town of some sort. Generally, that site planning effort can be relatively quick, not only because it's a smaller site and there's less to design, but also you have access to the engineers and people who can come out easily. We worked in some really remote sites, and it can actually take quite a long time to just get people out to the site to do that initial analysis that then feeds into the design process. So, I would say anywhere between a month and a half for a complete site development plan to even a year for very large hospitality developments. When you have a lot of complexities and potentially having to pass that plan through a local jurisdiction before anything is done, whether it's grading or infrastructure being pulled. That process as well can add significant time. So scale and location would be the biggest dictators of how long that takes.
So you're kind of referring to the county permitting process, which is going to vary by county, and they may have a single application process, they may have multiple application processes, and it's all going to be called different things. So for example, in my county, you can construct this kind of a project in two zones, the agricultural zone and the resource conservation zone. And regardless, it requires a special exception permit, which means you have to go through a two-step application process where your application goes to just the regular zoning administration, and then it goes before the Board of Zoning Appeals. And so there are essentially two phases where an application could be approved or denied. So, and I think Alex is sort of hinting at you've really got to communicate with your county early about this kind of project so you can get a sense of the appetite for it as well as the viability. So this is it's going to be a long process to be able to understand whether you can build this type of project where you're located. You hinted at the time and you've talked about cost a little bit all along. Can we get into more specifics about how much this sort of the site prep work could potentially cost? This is before you're getting into an actual site plan. Is there any sort of work that would need to be done before you can get to the site planning process? And then let's talk about the site planning process cost.
Yeah, sure thing. So I actually like to start our clients off with their vision first thing. So basically you have the land, you have the vision clarified, and start to overlap those two before anybody does anything major on the property. And I think that can look itself like a couple different ways. For instance, in Artistry Home, we offer hospitality consulting services where we can help analyze local markets and validate how many units you might be considering on a property and making sure that that's realistic. So having a really realistic vision to me is the very first thing before you even have engineers come out to the site or do any of that analysis. And of course, that can happen concurrently, doing that due diligence once that property is acquired to make sure that you haven't uncovered something that is going to make development extra challenging. And then once that is completed, and I say that effort could take anywhere between, a couple grand to just have those few hours to make sure that it's all consolidated and clear. to, $20,000 or $30,000 to have a really robust package together so that you can present it to investors, you can present it to the county, you can start to get that buy-in from your local community with that confidence. And once that clarity is in place, it really opens the way for the rest of the work to happen. And I often say if that work isn't done well, you're going to see that cost come back to you later in the project. For instance, we worked on a couple of projects where we've gotten 3/4 of the way through the design process. And because we didn't do our due diligence well enough, or the client didn't hire that out, essentially, that they skipped that cost, we ran into issues later in that process that then caused us to have to redesign and spend more money to get the design true to these things that we didn't consider. So I can't emphasize enough that it's totally worth spending more on this very, very early phase because it's going to end up saving you money in the long run. The design process itself, the site planning, it really depends a lot on your local area about the cost of those initial engineering reports. Generally, they can cost anywhere between $1,000 and $5,000 to get sort of those initial analyses that you'll need in order to understand what you're working with. Those are things like soil reports and ecosystem reports, environmental assessments, those kinds of things. Depending on the unique features of your site, for instance, if you have geothermal water, let's say you bought hot springs, or an old mine might be on your property, those things might require additional assessments to make sure that you're either treating the asset well or that there's not some sort of toxic waste from the mine. And those kinds of assessments, the specialty assessments, can be quite steep. So that, again, goes into picking the right site for you and your budget going forward. And then the site planning effort itself, again, location and scale is going to come into play, but that could be anywhere between $10,000 and $50,000, depending on the size of the property and the complexity. We've worked on projects that are primarily an owner build. The owner might have an idea of how to swing a hammer, or have family or friends that can help execute some of this work. And we can do things a little easier and lighter on cost in the design process. And then we have clients who are taking on a lot and trying to do it with outside investment. And we want to make sure we're, drawing every line that we need to before work happens. And that's going to increase the cost. So the cost can really vary quite dramatically. What I use as a rule of thumb generally for projects is take your overall construction budget, and 10% of that should be what it takes to design the project. That's from that very initial visioning phase all the way through construction administration.
Great. Okay, that's an excellent rule of thumb. The other rule of thumb that I would add when it comes to having that overall budget is to include a 15% contingency fund, because things can go over even in this early site design and site planning phase. So build yourself a cushion in the event that there are additional tests that you may need, additional permitting that you may need. It's you don't know what you don't know. And so make sure that you have that budget set aside. If people want to reach out to you, where do they go?
artistryhome.com is our website. You can also follow us on Instagram. I believe we're Artistry Treehouse.
Everything that you just learned from Alex is going to be completely useless if you don't have enough money to build the kind of luxury glamping site that he's talking about. So watch this video here where I walk you through the financing process to get the right kind of bank loan for your project. To become an Airbnb host and earn $40 after you host your first guest, sign up with my link down below and check out my links to furnish and decorate your Airbnb like a pro. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.